Hello, I'm Dr. John Mcdougall. You're about to listen to a presentation that will change your life. If you need more information, go to my website at drmcdougall.com. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a very difficult task ahead of me, but I think I'm up for the task. I have to talk to you about the problems of drinking milk. You know, milk, pure white as the fallen snow. You know, milk as warm as mother's touch. You know, milk that you can grow a whole baby with. You can grow a whole baby with just milk alone. It's only food. So shouldn't milk be nature's most perfect food? And you know, the hardest part of my body is the bones made of calcium. And they tell me it's such a perfect food that I never outgrow my need for milk. So I've got a really tough task ahead of me, and to make it even harder, let me tell you, I have a whole bunch of cows that have been educating you for your entire life. These are cows like Lonnie Moo in Hawaii, Elsie the cow in the Midwest, and here on the West Coast, up in Sonoma County, we have Chloe the cow. They are so intelligent, such good teachers, that they have convinced people that cow's milk is ideal food. And without it, you may not grow and you may die. Certainly you'll get sick, and you wouldn't dare raise your children without cow's milk, would you? Well, the cow that we're talking about offers false promises and false information. And I'm going to try and straighten some of that out with you today. First of all, I want to be absolutely clear. I am not talking about human milk for human babies. Breast milk is the absolute ideal food for babies. And don't make this mistake of not feeding your baby human breast milk. If you do make that mistake and you decide that you're going to feed formula, as is often encouraged, sad to say, by some well-meaning nurses and doctors and hospitals, that's changing, fortunately, but still not enough women breastfeed. But if you happen to be discouraged in breastfeeding, or you know somebody who is, think about what they face in terms of potential problems. A breastfed child has 2 to 4 times less risk of crib death, SIDS. A bottle-fed baby has 60 times greater chance of developing pneumococcal pneumonia in the first 3 months of life. And in the first year of life, if you happen to be bottle-fed, you have 10 times the risk of hospitalization. A reduced IQ is the consequence of a child deprived of human mother's milk. Now, I was breastfed for 3 weeks. I often tell my mother, if she'd have breastfed me longer, I'd have had Larry King's job. But I do the best I can. It interferes with behavior and speech problems you develop when you are bottle-fed. And then, if you happen to be a bottle-fed child, you develop a higher risk of childhood diseases, such as infections, asthma, eczema, type 1 diabetes, and cancers like lymphomas and leukemias. And it extends throughout life. There's an association of bottle-fed children with diseases as you become adults. For example, if you happen to be a bottle-fed as opposed to a breastfed child, you have a higher risk of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, food allergies, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. So it's imperative that you get the message to those you love that the only ideal food there is for a little baby is human breast milk. And they should make all efforts to make sure that child gets human breast milk. Now, when I talk to you about dairy products, I also want to tell you that I'm talking about all kinds of dairy products. Some of you are pretty well versed in the fact that whole milk is not good for you because of all the fat, and you think skim milk is health food. No, I'm talking about all dairy products. I'm talking about whole milk, I'm talking about skim milk, I'm talking about kefir, I'm talking about buttermilk, I'm talking about cheese, whey. Basically all the dairy products. Now they vary depending upon how much fat is in there and how much protein is in there, but really I'm condemning all of them when I discuss with you the facts associated with dairy products. Now, you know some of the things that I'm talking about. You've heard, for example, that eating dairy products, particularly high-fat dairy products, which is the way they come, by the way, don't they? That's how they come out of the cow, high-fat. You've heard that high-fat dairy products will give you heart attacks. That's no surprise. In East Finland, the highest consumer of dairy in the world back about 20 years ago, they had the highest death rate from heart disease. Now in Finland, they've changed their diet and decreased the intake of dairy products and drastically reduced that country's incidence of heart disease. But you've heard about high-fat dairy products, saturated fat in them, and heart disease. That's no surprise. You probably heard that dairy causes food allergies, the number one cause of food allergies. You may have gotten the idea, it's not a far stretch, that eating all that fat and all those calories will cause you to become obese. You've heard about these things, and maybe you've even heard that eating all that fat might give you a higher chance of getting cancer of the breast, prostate. So you know there's a problem here, don't you? But you also know that you have to consume dairy products because you must get your calcium. Now I want you to think about this for a minute. Does it make a lot of sense that we have to eat foods that make us sick in order to get a necessary nutrient? I mean, would we have evolved that way? Or if you believe, would we have been created by our divine creator to be in such a situation, such a paradox where to get a necessary nutrient, calcium, we'd have to risk heart disease, obesity, allergies, and maybe cancer? That should cause you to question the message from the dairy industry. And you also ought to question the message from the dairy industry because you see around the world there are populations of millions, actually billions of people who grow normal adult skeletons without having milk after they wean. So obviously it's possible you've got billions of Asians, you've got hundreds of millions of people from Africa, people from the Middle East who do not drink milk products after they wean, and they grow normal adult skeletons. You also know by looking around the animal kingdom that animals grow normal, huge skeletons like elephants, hippopotamuses, giraffes, without consuming milk after a weaning period. So it must be possible. But the dairy industry is out there to convince you otherwise. And they have a marketing plan. The dairy industry has the dairy checkoff, a unified marketing plan, and they have $50 billion of income to help support this plan. And the intention is to convince you that dairy products are good for you and your family. In fact, what their position statement is this: a major component of the marketing plan involves conducting and communicating results of dairy nutrition research showing the healthfulness of dairy products. Now notice what this says. This you will find on the internet under Dairy Checkoff, put out by Dairy Management Incorporated. They are telling you that their purpose is to design and carry out nutrition research that promotes dairy products. And they have $165 million to do that. They also have a statement there. This money, some of this money is going to be spent on issues and crisis management. I'm here to tell you, I am crisis management. Now, cow's milk is ideal to grow a baby cow. I mean, you grow a cow from 60 pounds when it's born, all the way up to around 600 pounds with cow's milk. Cows, when they eventually end up at full adult weight before they're slaughtered or sent off to be milked, are 1,000 to 1,500 pounds. But they're short. They're only 4.5 feet tall. And they look drastically different than people. And they are different. People and cows have different nutritional requirements. And this is where the problem comes in. It's really this basic. People are not cows, and cows are not people. You've heard the statement that no other animal drinks the milk of another species of animal. This is a very profound statement. It's said casually, but it has a lot of meaning to it. And it ought to cause you to pause when you think about the fact that you are dependent for good health and strong bones upon the milk of another species of animal. And the other statement you may have heard is that no animal drinks milk after it weans. Why would you require a food that's ideal for babies when you're an adult? It just doesn't seem to make any sense, does it? And so let's take a look at this in terms of actual numbers. Now, the easiest way to understand how different people and other animals are is to look at the breast milk of various animals. Nutritionists look at this. For example, scientists around the world these days consider the milk of a species of animal to be ideal food for that baby animal. Now, that isn't a great stretch to believe that, is it? Nature wouldn't make that kind of mistake. So, Scientists start with the premise that human breast milk is ideal for human babies, and cow's milk is ideal for calves, and dog milk is ideal for baby dogs, and so on. If you take a look at the nutritional makeup of the milks of animals, you see they vary greatly. They vary particularly in the protein content of these milks. And protein is very important for growth. And the amount of protein you have in an animal's milk reflects how fast that animal grows. In other words, if you have an animal that grows rapidly, you have a high protein content. An animal that grows slowly, you have a low protein content in that animal's breast milk. And so let's look at some figures. For example, humans have 1.2 grams for 100 grams of milk. And the doubling time for a human, in other words, the time to double in size for a human being, is about 3 months. If you take a look at a horse, its protein content is double of that of a human. It's 2.4 grams per 100 grams, and it doubles in size in 60 days. If you take a look at a cow, its protein content is 3.3 grams, and it doubles in size in 47 days. Look at a dog. Its protein content is 7, and it doubles in size in 8 days. And how about a rat? The protein content of a rat's breast milk is about 11 times greater than a human breast milk, and a rat baby doubles in size in 4.5 days. So obviously the nutritional makeup of that milk is set to be ideal for that particular animal in its greatest time of growth. That's the time that all animals grow most, is when they're little babies. Why would your nutritional requirements be any greater when you're not growing at all, say as an adult? Take a look at some of the other nutritional differences between human milk and cow's milk. For example, human milk has about 1/4 the calcium as cow's milk, and phosphorus, and sodium, and potassium. The nutrient content of human milk is very small compared to that of cow's milk for a very obvious reason. You've got to put a lot of nutrients, a lot of protein into that baby cow to get it to grow so rapidly to adult size. Whereas a human being, it grows very slowly. To make an adult human takes about 17 years. So we don't require that high a nutrient content. As a matter of fact, it's unhealthy to provide excess nutrients to a developing baby, as we'll see. One warning to you. You may not get the message that it's unhealthy to feed humans cow's milk, but I guarantee you there's a humane society out there that'll get you if you feed cows human milk. Because it has 1/4 the protein a cow needs and 1/4 the calcium. And they wouldn't grow, and they might die. The dairy industry has a primary campaign out there to teach you that the way to have strong bones is to drink milk. As a matter of fact, they basically tell you if you don't drink milk, you're going to have weak bones, you're going to have fractures. They even have an advertisement of somebody's arms being pulled off because they didn't drink enough milk. What an exaggeration. But they certainly make the point very strongly, don't they? If that were true, if you required milk as an older child or as an adult to grow a normal healthy skeleton, there wouldn't be Asian people or African people or people in the United States that don't drink milk at all because they have allergies or just don't like it. So you know that statement's not true. And they have a campaign, it's called 3 a Day. It's a takeoff from the 5 a Day fruit and vegetable campaign from the U.S. government. It's 3 a day. You're supposed to drink or eat 3 dairy products a day to maintain good bone health. And I want you to notice they don't just recommend low-fat dairy products. As a matter of fact, they recommend cheese and milk and maybe ice cream or yogurt. They recommend basically anything in the dairy line of products. And the intention, of course, is to sell you dairy products. The belief out there has been, up until recently, and it's changed, and I'll show you how it's changed, it's been this, is you need to consume dairy products because dairy products are a concentrated source of calcium, because it's necessary to have all that calcium to grow a cow. You know that now. It's a concentrated source of calcium, so what happens is this. At least I imagine this is what you have to believe, is that when you drink dairy products or maybe take calcium pills, what happens is you put a whole bunch of it in your mouth and it goes down your esophagus, into your stomach, and then into your intestine. If you shove it down fast enough and furious enough, it builds up in your intestine, it shoves itself through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, and then you build up that concentration and it pushes through the bloodstream and gets shoved right into the bones. Can you believe that? But that's the way you probably think, and I believe actually maybe some scientists think. Fortunately, that's not true. If that's the way that our gut acted, we'd be dead. If our gut was a passive sieve, and as a result, those calcium molecules could go through the gut wall into the bloodstream without any control. You know how what a sieve is. It's something you can drain food with, and water goes right on through just like holes, and nothing stops it and nothing controls it. If our gut was like a passive sieve and calcium got in there, based upon how much we ate, what would happen is we'd develop soft tissue calcification and we would die. Our hearts would become calcified, our kidneys, our muscles, and we would die. Fortunately, our gut wall is very intelligent. And when it sees us do silly things like take handfuls of calcium pills or drink gallons of milk or eat a whole bunch of cheese, what it does is it blocks that calcium out and leaves it in the bowel so we don't hurt ourselves. Now that gut wall is so intelligent that when we eat a lower calcium diet, and I say lower because there's no such thing as a too low calcium diet. Why can I say there's no such thing as a too low calcium diet? Because there has never been a case of dietary calcium deficiency ever reported in the world literature. In other words, no one has ever eaten a diet that was so low in calcium that they didn't have enough and as a result developed a disease. And I know you're thinking, I must have missed something. I'm missing osteoporosis here. But we'll continue this story and you'll see that I'm not missing that. So what happens when you eat a lower calcium diet, like the Japanese, Chinese, people from Africa do, without dairy products, without taking calcium supplements, is what happens is the gut wall reaches out, grabs that calcium that's in the food, pulls it in, and always meets our needs. Let's take a look at the calcium recommendations worldwide. First of all, basic science says that you need about 150 to 200 milligrams of calcium a day. Even if you're pregnant or nursing a baby, you need about 150 to 200 milligrams of calcium a day. When you look around the world at various populations of people, what we find is that in underdeveloped countries, the people consume about 300 to 500 milligrams of calcium a day. The calcium intake for the average American is 500 to 600 milligrams a day. The World Health Organization recommends that people consume about 400 to 500 milligrams of calcium a day. Why do they recommend 400 to 500 milligrams of calcium a day? Because they look around the world and see that there are populations of millions of people who do not drink milk, do not take calcium supplements, who have normal adult skeletons and their diet consists of 400 to 500 milligrams of calcium a day. They could come to no other conclusion. And then we have organizations that are heavily influenced by the money of the food industry that have exaggerated recommendations for calcium. They're like the United States Food and Nutrition Board and also the National Institutes of Health. They recommend somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day. Now, when you see these kinds of figures that I've shown you, what you must ask yourself is why the variation? Why tenfold? Why between 150 and 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day? Can't anybody get it right? Well, the reason there's such a variation is because there's a difference between intention on giving you these particular recommendations. One has to do with really meeting your needs, which is the 150 milligrams, and the other has to do with selling you products, which is 1,500 milligrams. And the reason there's such variation is because it really doesn't matter how much calcium you consume as far as your bone strength is concerned. And that's what the truth is. It depends upon another factor. One of the basic questions that should be asked, and you should ask it as a consumer, you should ask it as somebody who's worried about yourself or a loved one getting osteoporosis, you should ask, what does the scientific research show in terms of consuming dairy products and bone health? Well, that question was asked and answered in a publication in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in September of 2000. A couple of researchers decided they would review the literature, so they got all the studies that had been published in the scientific literature on cow's milk products, and bone health. And they found 57 studies. Now, they looked at these studies carefully, and they determined that 21 of them were worthy of including in their evaluation. They had good scientific method. And of those 21 studies, what they found is 57% showed no significant benefit from consuming dairy products on bone health. In other words, the majority. And they showed 29% showed favorable results, but 14% actually showed consuming dairy products hurt the bones. And that's what the research paper shows. Now, one of the things that you don't know, but I know because I read these papers very carefully, almost every one of these studies was paid for by the dairy industry, and yet the majority of them show that cow's milk does not improve bone health. Every consumer should know this. Now, there's a kind of study that doctors really respect. It's called a randomized controlled trial. And those are the kind of studies that really count. Now, randomized controlled trial means this. You try and make two groups that are very similar, in other words, randomized. And then you control one factor that you change. What you do is you get a control group, and you get another group that's essentially the same, and you just change one thing. Like in this case, you feed them cow's milk, and they become the experimental group. So you compare the control group and the experimental group, and there have been 7 randomized controlled trials on the effect of cow's milk on bone health. You should know that 6 of those trials, if you look in the paper itself, it says 6 of those trials were supported financially by the dairy industry. You should also know that only 1 trial looked at postmenopausal women consuming fluid cow's milk. In other words, only 1 trial really tested what we're concerned about, and that is, does fluid cow's milk, I'm not talking about calcium pills or cow milk pills or some other concoction they put together, but does drinking milk like is recommended by the dairy industry improve the bone strength and reduce the risk of fractures related to osteoporosis in women who are postmenopausal? 1 trial, that's it. And I bet you'd like to know what that trial says. That trial was published in 1985, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Ricker and Haney. That trial showed that the bone strength was actually hurt by consuming dairy products. So they fed them 3 ounces of skim milk a day for a year to supplement their calcium intake. And when they got done studying these women, they found out that they were consuming over 1,400 milligrams of calcium a day, those in the experimental group. And yet they also found that these women were still in negative calcium balance. In other words, they lost more calcium through their urine and feces than they absorbed into their body. That's what the one study that looks at postmenopausal women consuming fluid milk shows. Look at what happens when you change from whole milk to skim milk. When you change from whole milk to skim milk is actually 50% fat. You may not realize this. You may think whole milk because you see it in the store. You see on the carton it says 3.5% fat. You may say, well, that's really low fat. That's not true. They may advertise it as 3.5% fat, but what that means is that if you weigh the milk, which is mostly water, then 3.5% of the weight comes from fat. Well, you don't eat food based on weight, do you? You don't eat a 5-pound diet. You eat a 2,000 calorie diet. So if you look in terms of calories, which has to be the common denominator, what you find is of the calories that are present in whole milk, half of them are fat. All right, so all that fat's not so good for you. It makes you fat, increases your risk of heart disease, maybe cancers. So what they do is they take the fat out. When they take the fat out, they make low-fat milk, which is advertised as 2% fat. But really, that's 31% fat based on calories, which is what we're really counting here. And when you take all the fat out, now you have skim milk. But look at what happens when you take the fat out of the milk. When you take the fat out of the milk, you increase the relative concentrations of protein and also the milk sugar lactose. And this is where you get into some of the problems with the dairy products, is the protein content. You increase the protein content of the milk from 21% to 41% when you go from whole milk to skim milk. So we're feeding a high protein supplement to these postmenopausal women. All right, the study results. Published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 1985 by Ricker and Haney. They, by the way, are employees of the dairy industry. The research is funded by the dairy industry, and yet this is what they said. The protein content of the milk supplement may have a negative effect on calcium balance, possibly through an increase in kidney losses of calcium or through a direct effect on bone resorption. Now I want you to note these words that are in the study. They recognize, back in 1985, researchers paid for it by the dairy industry, recognize the fact that protein has a detrimental effect on calcium balance and the bones. Now, this is important for our further conversation. And they go on and they say this may have been due to an average 30% increase in protein intake during the milk supplementation. You see, when you add that skim milk, which has a high protein content, you increase the amount of protein in the overall diet, which negatively impacts the bones, which actually was shown in their research. Now, you may ask yourself, that study was done in 1985. Why don't they repeat the study? Well, would you? Let me explain to you how you get osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is due to the high protein, high acid content of the foods that we eat. What happens when we consume the American diet is we're consuming foods that are loaded with acid. Now, you can determine that by taking foods, and you can grind them up, and you can measure the pH and see how much acid is in the food. We've talked about the fact that animal products have a high content of sulfur-containing amino acids, and those sulfur-containing amino acids break down to sulfuric acid, which essentially results in a large acid load that is taken into the body 3, 4, and more times a day. The foods that are acid in the diet are cheeses, as a matter of fact, hard cheeses. As a matter of fact, Parmesan cheese is the most acidic food people commonly consume. Eggs, meat, fish, shellfish, poultry products, very high acid content. Your alkaline, in other words, base material that you get in your diet, comes from fruits and vegetables. Your body is slightly alkaline. It has a pH just a little bit above 7. The body must maintain its pH very carefully, and the reason is because all the chemical reactions in the body depend upon having a precise pH balance. And so if the pH balance gets out of whack, the body just works very, very poorly. So the body takes every effort to guard that acid-base balance and make it absolutely precise. So what we do is we sit down to the dinner table, we consume all this acid food, the body has to neutralize the acid. So how does it do that? Well, the primary buffering system of the body is the bones. Every scientist, every doctor, every medical student knows this. And so the bones dissolve, it releases bicarbonates and other alkaline material, and this alkaline material goes to buffer the acids. The consequence is, with this dissolved bone and other changes that take place when you eat this high animal protein, high acid diet, what happens next is all this bone material goes to the kidneys, and it's lost through the kidneys into the toilet. Now, sometimes this bone material, it solidifies in the kidney system, and it causes little rock-hard bones that are known as kidney stones. We even have the mechanisms worked out as to how this occurs. We know about how that acid prevents the reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys. We know how that protein increases the filtration rate of the kidneys and causes the kidneys to lose more calcium. We know how sulfur-containing amino acids like methionine paralyze the kidney tubules so they can't reabsorb the calcium. We know all these things. This is research that's been worked out for 20 or 30 years. Now, if what I tell you is true, we should see that in the scientific research. If you look around the world, you see something that is very interesting and undeniable. When you look around the world and you compare hip fracture rate, and hip fractures, by the way, are the most serious thing that can happen to people when it comes to osteoporosis. You can die from a hip fracture. When researchers look around the world and see where hip fractures are common and then compare that with things that people do, for example, what they eat, what they find is a direct straight line correlation between animal protein consumption and hip fracture rate. Countries where people consume very low amounts of animal proteins, for example in rural Africa or in Asian countries, they have a very low incidence of hip fractures. And by the way, in these countries, the women will often have 10 babies and nurse each baby on average of 10 months. So they have tremendous calcium drains from their body, and yet their bones remain as strong in their 70s and 80s as they were in their 20s. As you increase the animal protein intake, you go to countries like the United States, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, what you find is an increase in rate of hip fracture, a direct correlation. Now let's take and compare something else in the diet, and that's the calcium content of the diet and the calcium intake in various populations of people. What we find is as people increase their calcium intake in their diet worldwide, they also see a corresponding increase in risk of hip fractures. In other words, countries where people consume the least calcium, the population has the least hip fractures. Now, doesn't that strike you as interesting? Doesn't that at least say to you that consuming calcium has little or nothing to do with the strength of the bones? It certainly does to me. So the research has come to the point where well-read scientists and hopefully well-read consumers know that this idea that calcium is the problem is completely unsupported. It's not a lack of calcium that's the problem. As a matter of fact, as you read the literature and you look at the literature that I just showed you, should be clear that the problem really is a problem of too much protein, of too much animal protein. Well, the dairy industry has $165 million to do research of their own and to counteract this kind of information. And so they have done well. But it really surprised me to hear that their new approach was that the problem was not too much protein, but too little protein. Believe it or not. And so they have put a lot of money into proving that protein is really good for the bones and not bad for the bones, as the bulk of the scientific research shows. Let me explain to you how they do this. How do you show that protein is actually good for bones as opposed to bad for bones? Well, the first thing they do is they design experiments where they look at populations of people where these people also eat a lot of vegetable foods. Lots of fruits and lots of vegetables, which are very alkaline. And once you neutralize the acid from eating all these vegetable foods, then the effect of protein does seem to build the bones. So maybe the dairy industry is right. Maybe the meat and the pork industry are right. Maybe protein really is good for the bones. When you set up the experiment that way, they also take it to the laboratory. And what they do is this. They take populations of people in a laboratory setting and they give them antacids, like Citracal. And they neutralize the acid from their diet. And then they find as they increase the amount of protein in the diet, under these manipulated experiments, as they increase the amount of protein in the diet, they find that these people have characteristics of stronger, healthier bones. Seems like the dairy industry's finally got their mechanism. They can finally prove to us that dairy products are good for the bones. They finally worked it out so scientists like myself and other researchers can really understand that dairy products are good, since the calcium theory is just complete nonsense. Well, let me carry this a little bit further. What they discovered is that in dairy, in particular dairy, but also all high animal protein foods, is a growth hormone called insulin-like growth factor 1. Insulin-like means, if you look at it chemically, it looks like insulin, and it's a powerful growth stimulant. And so what they have decided is that what happens is when you feed higher protein diets, and this is what the pork and the beef industry are thinking, you feed higher protein diets, then we make more insulin-like growth factor 1, which promotes the growth of the bones. So they're getting their theory all intact. Everything seems to be working out well there. And they've even proved it in terms of various studies. Particularly when it comes to dairy products. They've done one study on adolescent girls, and they've done one study on postmenopausal women, and they've actually measured the amount of insulin-like growth factor 1 in the blood. And what they have found is that when you feed dairy products, you increase the amount of insulin-like growth factor 1 by about 10% in these women and young girls. And they just did a study on young boys. They actually tried to find out whether it was the protein or whether it was the dairy products that was really raising this hormone level. And so they took comparable amounts of protein, either as meat, low-fat meat, or as dairy products. And what they found is the dairy products increased the amount of insulin-like growth factor by about 19% in these young boys. So finally the dairy industry is vindicated. They have explained the mechanism as to how eating dairy products cause you to have stronger bones. Now, of course, it's very important that you neutralize the acid first, either by taking antacids or by eating a lot of fruits and vegetables for this to have any overall effect. So what counter do I possibly have to this? Well, the counter is in the overall problems that people are going to develop who buy into this message. And that is that insulin-like growth factor 1 is a growth stimulant. Yeah, it probably grows bones and grows bodies and grows lots of things. And one of the things it grows is cancer. In fact, one of the strongest promoters of cancer that researchers are studying these days is insulin-like growth factor 1. They found it to promote breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer. There's just a whole pile of evidence associating dairy product intake with prostate cancer. And this is one of the mechanisms that has been looked at in terms of why men who consume more dairy products have much more prostate cancer. You see, what happens is insulin-like growth factor 1 stimulates growth. It causes cells to proliferate, which you don't want your cancer cells to do. And it prevents cells from dying, which you don't want your cancer cells to do. So it may be true on one hand that they have found a way to stimulate bone growth and found the mechanism, and they may convince you, but you need the whole story. It's certainly something you do not want to take advantage of. Let me explain another way that all of this milk may promote bone growth. You know that consuming female hormones, in particular estrogen, makes the bone strong. You've been educated on this by the pharmaceutical industry for 40 years. Take hormones. After you go through menopause, you'll have stronger bones. Well, how can you get extra hormones from what you eat? Well, dairy products, it's estimated, provide 60 to 70% of the estrogen that comes to people through food. And one of the interesting ways that this estrogen gets in people through dairy products has to do with the farming practices that occur today. It used to be when you had a dairy cow on the farm, you got a quart of milk a day. It used to be when you had a cow on the farm and the cow got pregnant, you let the cow have a break. And you let her go through her pregnancy without being milked every day. That's the way it used to be. But with modern farming practices, that's not the way it is. They'll get 24 quarts of milk out of a cow a day, and they milk that cow through the whole pregnancy. During pregnancy, the female, the cow, produces estrogens. And you can see this in the milk that you get at various stages of pregnancy from that cow. For example, in a non-pregnant cow, you have 15 picograms per milliliter of estrogen. During the first half of pregnancy, it is increased by tenfold. You have 151 picograms. But during the last days of pregnancy, it's 1,000 picograms per milliliter. Yes, you may be promoting bone growth by getting estrogens from cow's milk, but do you think that's good for you? You know what else you promote with all that estrogen, don't you? Breast cancer, uterine cancer, just to name a few problems. The latest effort, and this is even more surprising, the latest effort of the dairy industry is to try and teach you that consuming dairy products is the best way to lose weight. Don't you think there's a problem here? Don't you think there's a disconnect? It just shows you how far the dairy industry will go and how much false information you can spread if you've got enough money. They have advertisements that appear in your magazines that tell you that you should look to your refrigerator to solve your weight problems. Now, the researchers who publish the research are in the pockets of the dairy industry. They pay for this research. That should give you one clue that there's a slight bias here. There's a man I'd like you to introduce you to. His name is Greg Miller. Greg Miller is the Senior Vice President of Nutrition Research of the National Dairy Council. He works for the Dairy Management Incorporated, which is the organization that is involved in marketing all of these dairy products, spending the $166 million a year to promote dairy products and nutrition research. He's a PhD in nutrition. This is no lightweight researcher. And I've known him for over 10 years, Greg Miller, Dr. Greg Miller. First time I met him was on a television show back about 1993. Now, Dr. Greg Miller, he says some interesting things. We'll talk about him a little later, too, so keep him in mind. One of the things that Dr. Miller says on the internet, he says independent research confirming dairy's role in weight reduction is mounting. He tells us this helps to position dairy foods as part of the solution to America's growing obesity epidemic, Greg Miller says. And he tells us informing the public about dairy's role in the fight against obesity, really this is the bottom line. Dairy's role in the fight against obesity will help increase consumption of milk, cheese, yogurt, among other dairy products. Notice they don't just say consuming low-fat milk would be good for weight loss. They mention all the dairy products Dr. Greg Miller does. What is the purpose of cow's milk? The purpose of cow's milk is to grow a cow from 60 pounds to 600 pounds. How all of a sudden did cow's milk become the new anti-obesity drug? The miracle weight loss product of the 21st century. I just cannot understand it. How could you take such a leap in understanding and common sense? Well, if you've got $166 million, you can do anything, I guess. Let's take a look at some of the research that has been published and funded. The publication has been funded by the dairy industry. They tell us in one of the review articles that there have been studies done comparing the effect of weight loss and calcium consumption. And these are some of the statements that are made. One of the 17 randomized studies found weight loss in people taking calcium pills. That means 16 out of 17 studies that have been done, and this was published in the year 2003. 16 out of 17 studies taking calcium pills do not show weight loss, but one does. Now the idea is this: when you consume calcium, what it does is it grabs a hold of fat in the food and prevents the fat from making you fat. But the actual research says it doesn't work. They continue in this very same paper. They continue and say 9 randomized studies where fluid milk was added, 2 showed significant weight gain, and none showed significant weight loss. This is a review paper of the studies on the effect of dairy products on weight control. And yet you see advertisements that show exactly the opposite. You ought to be surprised. In fact, you ought to be angry. Here's one of the studies, sponsored by the International Dairy Foods Association. You might suspect a bias, but look at the results. 204 healthy men and women increased skim and 1% milk by 3 cups a day for 12 weeks. And what happens is they gained 1.32 pounds. Now, they didn't feed them cheese and ice cream and whole milk and the other products that are advertised to you directly as a consumer to consume because that's your new solution for weight loss. No, they fed them skim milk or low-fat milk, and they gained weight. Can you imagine what happened as they fed them what they're advertising in the advertisements today? Can you imagine what would happen to people? Well, the Dairy Management Incorporated, the ones that are involved with all this aggressive marketing, they had a symposium, April 24th, 2002 in New Orleans, on dairy product components and weight regulation. One of the employees of the dairy industry, Susan Barr, PhD, dietitian, what she says in her concluding statement is, in conclusion, the data available from randomized trials of dairy products or calcium supplementation provide little support for an effect in reducing body weight or fatness. The dairy industry knows they are lying. Everything you once believed about nutrition is now false. There are no limits to where the dairy industry will not go in terms of spreading misinformation. The dairy industry has teamed up with the National Medical Association to write articles about this statement, by the way, you can find on the internet, to write about the role of dairy in helping reduce the risk of heart disease, hypertension, and other serious health issues. Can you believe this? I mean, you always thought eating all those high-fat, high-cholesterol dairy products would give you a heart attack. But now the dairy industry is telling you that's not the case. And they have credibility. They have teamed up with the National Medical Association. Would you like to know who the National Medical Association is? I wanted to know. The National Medical Association promotes the collective interests of physicians and patients of African descent. Now, what do African Americans have in common in terms of health and dairy products? Lactose intolerance. They get diarrhea, stomach cramps, and gas. 90% of them are lactose intolerant. How in the world does the dairy industry, who promotes a product that makes African Americans sick, gets teamed up with the National Medical Association? How does that happen?
They lose weight.
I won't even offer the answer for you, but it comes in the form of $166 million, at least in part. High blood pressure. Here's a review article paid for by the dairy industry where they looked at the studies on high blood pressure. They tell you the way to reduce your blood pressure is to eat more dairy products. So these researchers, funded by the dairy industry, they looked at the studies. 67 studies were found. 47 were worth really looking at because they had decent data. The decrease in blood pressure was found to be about 1/1 millimeter of mercury. Do you know that in our program, in about 72 hours with people who have definite high blood pressure, we drop their blood pressure 23/14 millimeters of mercury in about 3 days, and we get almost every one of them off medication. And the dairy industry is bragging about a 1/1 millimeter drop in blood pressure. Certainly in their advertisements, the message comes across a lot different than what the scientific research really shows. So the dairy industry is spending $166 million annually to give you false information. They're telling you things that you may have believed up to this day, but the scientific research does not support. They're telling you that dairy products are proper for human nutrition. You know that cannot be true. These products are designed for cows, and you are not a cow. They tell you it's necessary to have calcium, and you know that's not true. You look around the world and people have strong, healthy bones, and they do not consume dairy products. They tell you these dairy products are necessary to prevent osteoporosis. Well, if that was true, we wouldn't have Asians or Africans in this country, at least no elderly ones. And it's an effective weight loss program. I guess they're just trying to see how far they can go, to see if there's really any limits where consumers will stand up, and maybe even a government agency will stand up and say, you can't do this anymore. I don't think they've reached the limits. I don't know what they'll say next, but I won't be surprised based on what they've said in the past. But what you need to know is that dairy products are a serious health hazard. Dairy products are not necessary for good health. But I really haven't completed my message to you. All I hope I have done is convince you of the fact that dairy products are not necessary for your personal health. These are not necessary foods to have strong, healthy bodies. Hopefully I've gone that far with you. What I'd like to do is I'd like to carry on this conversation, and I'd like to tell you the real downside of consuming dairy products. You need to know what the real impact is in terms of your health. And I'm going to tell you that in just a moment. Thank you.